name's Weekly, Neil Weekly. As my story opens, I'm a librarian, private. Until recently I was just one of the many cub librarians working for a large London borough which I'd better not name. I must have been some kind of dope. I was working in the same branch for 13 years before I cottoned on to the filthy corrupt system of graft that operated beneath a thin veneer of public service. I hit upon this network of shame, quite by chance. It was a hot June day. I was on the inn counter. It had been quiet that day, and I was thinking of getting home to Tessa, my salad, and the rug-making teaching on BBC Two. Then in walks Mrs. Staphanopoulos, Greek Cypriot, 65, 5'6", westerns and jean ladies. She brought her book to the counter. It was a week overdue. She was a nice old lady, a widow. I was about to let it go. Then it happened. She slid a fiver across the issue desk. I told her there was only 10p to pay, but she insisted I keep the change. I thought maybe she didn't understand the system, and then it hit me. What a fool I'd been. These people that for 13 years I thought of as my friends and colleagues were nothing but a bunch of hoods, viciously extorting vastly inflated overdue fines from these innocent, bewildered people who we pretended to make welcome in our country. I felt sick. Worse than that, I felt green, like I was just out of library school. I went to see the chief, and told him what was going on. For a minute he was silent. Then he shrugged. He was as nice as can be. He gave me coffee, he gave me biscuits, he gave me excuses, he gave me my P45. But I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. My resignation was already in the internal mail. I made my way slowly back to the flat, my world in ruins. It was Tessa's night to make the salad. She prepared a beautiful one, walnuts, mushrooms, sauce vinaigrette, all my favourite ingredients. But I hardly tasted it. After supper I told her. We sat and talked until the early hours, the ashtrays before us piling up with half-smoked herbal cigarettes. Neither of us was much in the mood for rug-making that night. She said she'd resign as well, but I said no. Already an idea was forming in my mind. If it was to be successful, I was going to need someone on the inside, someone still in the library service. It was going to be tough for her, but I knew she could take it. She was no stranger to fear. She worked in the children's section. So that was how I came to be in a dingy office above a chip shop in Islington, running a one-man investigation librarianship bureau. And that was how I came to be sitting there one Tuesday morning, twiddling my thumbs and wondering where the work was going to come from, when in walks this blonde. She'd everything. She'd just been shopping. My instincts told me that this was my first case. She seemed nervous. This was probably the first time she'd ever consulted a private librarian. Well, that made two of us. My palms were sweating as I showed her to the fold-away plastic chair on the other side of the desk. "Well, lady," I said, "tell me your story." Her name was Christine, but I called her Mrs. Braithwaite. At first she was reticent. "Look, Mrs. Braithwaite," I said, "if you don't tell me everything, I can't help you." Then she spilled the beans. Then she spilled the tea, and finally the sugar. As I helped her repack her shopping, she told me her sad story. 2 months ago a neighbour had moved house, and now was getting near her birthday. Unfortunately for Christine, she'd used a piece of paper with her neighbour's new address on to clean up while one of the twins had been sick. My job looked simple. She wanted me to get the neighbour's new address from the voting list at the Central Reference Library and report back to her. My suspicions were aroused. I asked her why she couldn't go herself. She gestured at the 4 bags of shopping and at the pushchair full of twins. "What do you bloody well think?" she snapped. "My husband's on nights." That seemed fair enough. The whole thing seemed neat and easy. Ideal for a first case. If only I'd known then what I know now. Somehow I didn't feel up to revisiting my old beat, which was unfortunately where the relevant voting list was kept. Now was the time for me to call in a few favours. So 6 o'clock that evening found me leaning against a pale green 69 Mini Countryman outside Central Library. I was on my 3rd herbal cigarette and coughing like a hurricane when Steve finally showed. He was surprised to see me, and from the look on his face I guessed it wasn't a nice surprise. "What the hell do you want, Neil?" he croaked hoarsely, looking round to see we weren't being observed. The chief had a way of knowing what went on in his territory. Telepathy, bush telegraph, internal memos. I don't know how it worked, but Steve was clearly scared for his promotion. "Don't you know what it could mean for me, just being seen with you?" he pleaded. "Okay, Steve," I said. "How about a drink? I think I owe you one, and, I think you owe me something." "I thought I paid you back those luncheon vouchers," he said, scrabbling frantically in his breast pocket. "Put them away, Steve," I said in disgust. "This isn't luncheon vouchers. This is something much bigger." Over a round of vodka and pineapples I explained what I wanted. At first he was reluctant, until I reminded him about Ruth, the Saturday girl, the Christmas party, and his wife and kids. He saw the connection. I didn't like to do it to an old friend, but then Steve didn't seem like a friend anymore. I realized that all my old ideas about friendship and loyalty were about as useful as last week's colour supplements in the tough, hard-boiled world outside the service. And from now on, my client had to come first. The next day the phone rang at the office. It rang again later when I was in. I picked it up. It was Steve. I couldn't make out much of what he said because of the handkerchief he was talking through, but what I did get made me put down my macrame and listen hard. The page of the voting list that should have told us the address of Joan Kennedy, Christine's mysterious neighbour, was missing. It had been neatly torn from the register. Steve reckoned it was an inside job, the work of a professional, and he told me he couldn't go any further with this. He asked me to think of his wife. I did. I also thought of Ruth, the Saturday girl. But I couldn't really blame him. This case no longer looked as simple as I'd first thought. So I said goodbye and put the phone down on another friend. Before he went, he gave me one tip. He told me to try the town hall. The word was that was where they kept the master copy. I got there around 3. After making sure I wasn't being followed, I went up the steps into the foyer. "Where do you keep the electoral register?" I asked. "Who wants to know?" was the surly reply. I looked the uniformed attendant up and down, 7'1", and that was just the shoulders. I decided I could do without tangling with her. I showed her my Library Association card. Reluctantly, she led me down a passage to a room where the voting lists were kept. I thought that at last this nightmare was over. Sure enough, there was Joan Kennedy's address. But what I hadn't bargained for was that it was circled in red, and so was that of the shop next door. The Lee Harvey Oswald School of Marksmanship, they called themselves. My mind was reeling like it inhaled next to a perfume salesman. There had to be a connection. I decided I'd pay them a visit, but first I had to talk to Christine. I rang her from the phone box outside the town hall, wondering vaguely if it was bugged. She answered. The pips went. I gave her the lowdown on the Kennedy case. She seemed pleased and said my check was in the post. Then she hung up, as vaguely in the background I heard her twin screaming. I could have left it at that. The case was finished. But no. There never was a librarian born who could resist following through an inquiry. There never was a librarian born with that much sense. The next port of call should have been to the Lee Harvey Oswald School of Marksmanship, but right now was tea time, so I jumped on a 38A bus back to Tessa. It was my night to make the salad. By the time Tessa got home from work, it was waiting for her on the table. Walnuts, mushrooms, sauce vinaigrette, all my favourite ingredients. Tessa never liked walnuts. I can't understand it. I love them. When she saw the food, she gave me one of her hungry looks. "I'll go and slip into something a bit more comfortable," she said. 5 minutes later she was back, wearing a fluorescent boiler suit and a badge saying, "Librarians make better lovers." I knew what that meant. Tomorrow was another day, and Oswald could wait until then. "Okay, Mr. Oswald," I snapped. "What does the name Kennedy mean to you?" "What?" he said. "Ken Kennedy from next door?" "Yeah, I know him. Him and his wife Joan just moved in a couple of months ago. He helps us out when we're one short for the darts team." "Darts?" I queried, my eyes narrowing. So that was his game. "Yeah, we're a school of marksmanship. We teach darts. Our specialty is what we call the Dallas Flick. 3 of you throw 1 dart each from different corners of the room, and they all have to land simultaneously in the bullseye. It's a sort of party piece. The idea is to make it look like only one of you has thrown all 3. But he wasn't getting away with it that easy. I had one more question for him. "So how come your name and the Kennedys were circled in red on the voters' list?" "Oh, was it?" he replied. "Doesn't surprise me. We're both in arrears with our rates." His explanation seemed reasonable enough at the time. I threaded my way home through the thronging streets of rush-hour downtown Euston, little knowing what perverse twist of fate had in store for me. Just before I reached the station, a cop car pulled up alongside. "You Weekly?" barked one of the blue-clad torpedoes inside. I wouldn't say he looked stupid, but his hairline ended where his eyebrows began. "Yeah, that's me," I told him, reaching inside my jacket for my Library Association card. Suddenly they were both on top of me, pinning me to the pavement. "Hold him!" yelled one of the cops. "He's got a shooter!" I felt a bottomless pit open up beneath me, and I seemed to be spinning down, down, down. As soon as they got me out of the roadworks, they bundled me into the back of a car, and we sped off downtown to police headquarters. "Okay," said Inspector Dewey for the 10th time. "How much of a kickback did you get for putting Christine Braithwaite at the top of the reservations list for the latest Harold Robbins?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I told him. They weren't getting me to confess to anything I hadn't done. What a dope I'd been. Then it finally hit me that the whole Kennedy case had been a set-up from beginning to end. "Leave it out, son," snapped Dewey. "The Braithwaite dame has already spilled the beans." "Oh, really? She did that in my office as well. She ought to buy a net shopping bag," I wisecracked. "All right, Neil," said the inspector, a strange new glint in his eye. "You want to do it the hard way? I'll ask my colleague, Inspector Bliss, to step in. How shall I put it? He's not as lenient as I am." For what seemed like the 100th time I told them I'd been framed, but Inspector Dewey wasn't buying any. I demanded to see my mouthpiece, and they sent for Tessa. Now for the first time I got the feeling that Dewey and I were speaking at cross purposes. Still, I was glad to see Tessa. She bought me a salad, anchovies, olives, green peppers, all her favourite ingredients. That should have told me something. What a dope I'd been. They certainly picked the right candidate for a fit-up. They didn't even have to try very hard. I made it easy for them. I tried to convince Tessa I'd been framed, but she wasn't having any either. I told her how I figured it, just like I told the cops, how my resignation letter to the chief must have been filed in the basket marked waste paper. How they were all in on it, the chief, Steve, Christine, Oswald, the Kennedys. Or maybe they never were any Kennedys. Maybe I'll never know. Maybe it doesn't matter anyway. Maybe it does. But no, probably it doesn't. But I guess I'll never know anyway. And I guess there weren't any Kennedys. And I guess it doesn't matter anyway. But... My reverie was interrupted by Tessa getting up to leave. It was then that I noticed the brand new caftan. I could tell it was new because it was clean. I already knew the answer, but I asked it anyhow. "Where did you get the money?" I said. She didn't say anything, but she looked a little sad and walked out of the door and out of my life. The last I heard of her, she was running a feminist bookshop in Uptown Lyme Regis with Ruth, the Saturday girl. They were planning to bring up Steve's child as their own. Kind of cozy, I guess, if you like that sort of thing. That was the last straw. I thought it was the real thing with me and Tessa. During all the nightmare that this had been, she had been the one consistent lighthouse in a storm-tossed sea of corruption, betrayal, and sudden death. And now that lighthouse itself had floundered on the ragged rocks of outrageous fortune. When Inspector Bliss, the so-called hard man, came into my cell, I was ready to confess. I noticed a look of disappointment in his face. He looked like he'd had a lean week. "Well, you and me both, pal. You and me both." I felt kind of sorry for him, but I'd had enough. If they wanted to cover up the Overdue scandal by making me the fall guy for the whole racket, then that was okay by me. I signed. I also signed confessions to the Great Train Robbery, Auschwitz, and the murder of the princes in the tower. For some reason, these last 3 confessions were never produced in court. The trial was a farce which I won't bother you with. Suffice to say that at the end of the day they shook the judge awake and he gave me the ultimate sanction. The chair. So that's how I come to be sitting here, in this chair, as Professor of Librarianship at the University of Bogota. Since I was struck off the Librarians' Register, I can never work again anywhere in Europe or America. And this is my reward for trying to clean up the service. but I wouldn't rub out a single page. Sometimes my students ask me if it wouldn't have been easier to go along with the graft, and I'd have to tell them that I had no choice. A librarian's gotta do what a librarian's gotta do. It's, how shall I say, something in the blood.